Good evening. I'm Tim Bolton, Head of Programmes here at Dartington, and on behalf of everyone at Schumacher College in Dartington, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's Earth Talk. How does soil health and gut health interact with Jane Gleeson? And thank you all so much for supporting the work of Schumacher College. We've been holding Earth Talks for a number of years, face-to-face in the Old Postern and the Great Hall at Dartington. It's a fundamental part of our learning community, and we look forward to doing so again, with our first planned face-to-face Earth Talk taking place in the Great Hall on the evening of September the 25th with Satish Kumar on the topic of soil, soul and society. The number of places is limited due to social distancing, but for those of you not able to attend in person, the talk will also be available online. If you're new to the online Earth Talks, then all the previous talks, which have taken place since lockdown, are also available on the Schumacher College website, as is an archive of talks from the last few years. So first, a few words about the format of the evening. In a moment, I'll hand over to Jane Gleeson to present her talk. We do want the session to be as accessible and interactive as possible, so please do use the chat button on the bottom of your screen to share thoughts with us and your fellow audience members. And we'd welcome questions throughout using the Q&A link, again at the bottom of the window. Jane might respond to some of the questions as we go along, and I'll have a chance to put other questions to her during and at the end of the conversation. In total, we anticipate the session to last about an hour. So let me start by introducing Jane. Jane Gleeson graduated in medical sciences at Cambridge University in 1990 and spent over 10 years working within the field of mental health. She also studied theology, looking at religion and mental health. 20 years ago, she started gardening and was soon completely hooked. She studied and worked at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew for 3 years and then taught horticulture at Haddow College. Jane ran the Schumacher Gardens and the practical residency in sustainable horticulture at Schumacher College for the last 7 years and is now teaching short courses in sustainable horticulture and food production. This Earth Talk was initially scheduled as part of a short course which would have been taking place right now, entitled Forest Gardens and Edible Ecosystems. But that course is now rescheduled for the end of April 2021, but we're really pleased to be able to welcome Jane here tonight to carry on and give her talk. So over to you, Jane Gleeson.
Hello, people hopefully can hear me now. I'll just get the talk up. From the beginning. Great. Okay. Well, thank you to Tim for that introduction. I was thinking of starting off myself with just a couple of, they're not quite anecdotes, but what I would describe really as moments where things suddenly hit you in a way that's beyond mere intellectual knowledge. And when I was a junior doctor, which was a long time ago, working on a busy ward in London, there was a pause in the ward round where probably searching for someone's x-ray or whatever, and it just suddenly hit me with quite a force that we really were just picking up the pieces with what we were doing in the hospitals. I'm not saying it's not important, of course it is, but I did think, gosh, we really are just picking up the pieces here. What's led people to be here is a myriad of other things, and we're left dealing with the consequences of those. And then, whilst I started on my horticultural career, part of that training was at Kew Gardens, and at Kew there's a whole range of plants. Obviously, some of them are quite rare and specialised. And I was very much on the track for mainly doing ornamental horticulture. But in the course of the training, we had to start a veg plot. And whilst doing some research for that, I came across actually in Resurgence, so it's thanks to Satish when he was editing Resurgence, the startling figure, which still holds true today, that modern agriculture has an energy input of 10 kilojoules for every 1 kilojoule of food it creates. And peasant, for want of a better word, agriculture, so old-fashioned, not high-tech, not industrialized, has a ratio of input to output of about 1 to 1. And I just found that, I just thought, gosh, that's bonkers, you know. And that set me on a path of getting very interested in food and how we grow it, which really culminated with working at Schumacher. And the third thing, when something hit home at a level that's beyond just mere intellectual knowledge, was actually when I was clearing a footpath outside a building at Schumacher. It was a footpath that, for want of a better description, had been rather neglected. And it was hard to know if there was actually a footpath under there. And I discovered this beautiful footpath, and it was certainly worth unearthing. But I came across this lovely, you know, the border on either side had grown over the footpath, and it looked really narrow, and it was actually quite wide. But the earth that had grown over it was quite thick and had plenty of vegetation in it. And I cast my thoughts back to this idea that in natural processes, in geological time, it takes an awful long time for us for nature, for the earth, to create soil. And I thought, well, gosh, this path's not been covered for that long. It's not hundreds and hundreds of years. And so that sort of led on to the realization that we do have ways and means of regenerating soil, which are vital given what we're doing with our soils worldwide. So essentially there, I want to link this idea of health and soil and how we grow our food. Essentially all life depends upon soil. The soil it's not soil if it doesn't contain life, and we would not be alive if it wasn't for soil. So there's that complete and utter inextricable interdependence. They have evolved together. That's a picture, many of you watching will probably recognize that. That's a pine seedling that was grown in a glass box. And what you can see there is the sort of darker orange, thicker strands are the actual roots of the plant, and the whiter filigree network, a beautiful branching network, is fungal mycelium. So it's just showing you the importance of one type of microbe in the life of that small seedling. Soils are vital, like I say, and the way we treat them, you wouldn't believe that to be the case. And this is one of those fairly depressing bits of information that you can look up. This is from the UN Environmental Programme, and it's showing the states of soils globally. And as you can see, just casting your eye over that, we're not doing very well when it comes to looking after our soils. They get lost due to wind erosion, due to water erosion, secondary salinisation from irrigation. The way we're treating the land that we grow food to sustain us is unsustainable. If you're interested in the history of how civilizations have fallen because of their poor treatment of their soils, I recommend David Montgomery's book on soil, the erosion of civilizations. So that's rather shocking. And we're losing 0.3% of topsoil per year. And you might think, well, 0.3%, that's not too bad. I mean, you know, sure, it will take us a while to run out, but times that by 100, or even my lifespan, 50 odd years, 15 to 30%, you soon see how we could run out. And we've already degraded about a quarter of our land worldwide. So we need to change our act quickly. The good news is we can, of course. This is some figures taken from a very good report from the Royal Society on the states of farming in the UK. And it's well worth reading. There's a nice executive summary, but it's showing that UK agriculture is linked to both our ecosystem crisis, the fact that we're in climate crisis of climate chaos, and our current health crisis. In the UK agriculture is responsible for about 11% of greenhouse gas emissions. Globally, it's higher. And there's this massive decline in biodiversity and species loss. Running alongside that at the same time is the fact that our health is declining rapidly. Now, it's a bit ironic to say that during the global pandemic, but we are suffering more and more from chronic disease, and that's got an economic and social cost to it. And I want to look at how those two things are linked. How we're treating our land and growing our food is linked to our crisis in health, particularly, like I say, the rising chronic disease. It's not all bad news. We can continue with agri-business, with large-scale industrial monocultures that are destroying the resources upon which we depend, or we can switch to far more friendlier forms of food growing. And we do have a choice there. It would be a whole other talk to describe to those of you who aren't aware of what agroecology is, what it is, but essentially it's a way of producing food that minimizes the harm done to the environment. And I want to say that I'm not bashing farmers, by the way. I think farmers have a very difficult job on their hand, and if anything, we need to support our farmers. But the agricultural industry, agribusiness, and it is an industry, and it treats food as a commodity. There's various theories as to why we ended up with the system that we've got today. Many say it was because of the Industrial Revolution and our belief in industry and mechanistic linear thinking. Others say it was because of the discoveries of how plants actually feed themselves. It became very chemically based rather than biologically based. That's a factory that's producing nitrogen fertilizer. It's a process known as the Haber-Bosch process. Now, nitrogen surrounds us in our atmosphere. We're not short of nitrogen gas, but for a plant to get hold of that nitrogen is actually quite difficult because it's a very stable gas. And two German chemists came up with a way of doing that, and actually that proved very useful for manufacturing explosives during wartime. Whilst not at war, governments were very keen to make sure that they still had the capacity to produce those explosives, and hit upon the idea of creating ammonia-based, nitrogen-based fertilizers, basically. Now, prior to that, any nitrogen that was in your body that came from your diet would have been naturally occurring, biologically created nitrogen coming from legumes, from pea plants, basically, anything in the pea family, and one or two others. Nowadays, about 50% of our bodies have nitrogen that's come from the very energy-intensive and polluting Haber-Bosch process. And there's all sorts of difficulties with our use of synthetic fertilizers in farming. Its effect on soil life and its ability to pollute, and the fact that it's very energy intensive. For those of you that may not be aware of it, certain plants have the ability to do this very difficult thing of breaking open nitrogen gas and creating things like ammonium and nitrates, which the plant can take up. And they live in these tiny little nodules that the plant creates. and they house bacteria. So it's one example of many where we are completely reliant on microbes and microbial life for our own existence. I've put this in really just, we of course, we all need to eat. And like I say, I'm not saying that agriculture is evil incarnate. You know, we have to eat, we have to find a way to grow our food. And there isn't a way of growing food that doesn't interfere, for want of a better word, or doesn't, well, there is a better word actually, doesn't involve an interplay with the natural environment around us, of which we're a part, of course. And I'm certainly, like I say, not just bashing farmers. Many farmers know that industrial agriculture isn't that great, but they're locked financially into these systems that make it very difficult for them to transit out. So we have to support farmers apart from anything else, and that does require a whole shift in culture. But just as an example here, really it's a statement about how we value food. And I know there's been talk during the coronavirus pandemic that people are realising the importance of food and food supplies and local supply chains. And it would be great if that awareness outlived the pandemic. But just as an example, the average UK household spent 40% of its budget on food in the 1950s. Now we spend 12%. And I find this quite shocking. The producers, the people that grow that food, used to get 80% of every pound you spent buying that food. Now they get 8p, which I think is shocking, and needs addressing. The easiest way to do that is try to buy direct from a producer if you can, if you're lucky enough to have a local farm shop or a veg box scheme or whatever. But farmers need our support. The people growing our food need our support. I mentioned at the start that the 10 kilojoules of energy, creating 1 kilojoule of food energy in industrial agriculture, whereas more traditional systems, what's sometimes referred to as peasant agriculture, which is enjoying a renaissance of being something good rather than something outdated. It's highly inefficient and it doesn't feed us. It feeds us in part. You could argue that some of what's produced in it isn't actually food, but would be better off being defined as a poison, to be honest. But industrial large-scale monocultures are by far the biggest driver of ecological destruction that's due to agriculture. About 75% of the ecological destruction caused by the way we grow our food is due to the industrial way of growing food. Yet the output of that, only about 30% will actually reach a human and be consumed. It's the remaining 70% that's produced by small-scale growers across the world. And rather, I was going to say ironically, but actually rather, it's a crime really. Many of those can't themselves afford to eat. The fact that we need to eat, therefore need to have impacts upon our natural environment, surely impels upon us to do it as efficiently as possible. And with all that ecological destruction, there are still many people in the world going hungry and many more malnourished. Of course, one reason why certain chemical companies and agribusiness say that they have to go down this very high-tech route, whether it's GMO or whatever, is that they're ethically obliged to ensure that the world can be fed. But of course, we grow enough food already to feed over 9 billion people. And I have no doubt that we could feed 11 billion if that's what we reach by the next 100 years or whatever. It's the fact that that food is not getting to where it should. It doesn't end up a lot. Globally, it's about 30 to 50% never actually reaches the human stomach. And a lot of that's due to waste. It's unequally distributed. And I think waste of food is one of the biggest, like I say, the biggest crimes against nature that we have, really. But to come on to, so that was just an introduction to how we grow our food is important. But I want to focus now more on how the way we grow our food and looking after the biology of the soil actually has massive impacts on our own human biology and our own microbiology. And the rather fascinating and very active area of research at the moment are the links between the two. So, like I say, soil really isn't soil unless it's alive. It's a dynamic, ever-changing, thriving community of life. Now, these sort of numbers are quite hard to sort of get your head round, but in 1 gram of soil, there are more microorganisms, healthy soil, by the way, there are more microorganisms in 1 gram of healthy soil than there are stars in the universe. At least 9 times more. And that's, you know, it's just chock-a-block full of invisible life. Some of the soil biology, of course, is visible. We you know, earthworms is a good example, or mites, or various other creepy crawlies that you can see making their way through a healthy soil. And they play a key role in plant health and ultimately in our own health. I've just got a message. I'm hoping people can hear me. I don't think I'm blocking the mic. I hope I'm not. Okay. The soil food web. Like I say, soil is full of life, and a key part in keeping it that way is to make sure that it has organic matter. Now, organic matter, put very simply, is something that was once alive and is now dead. So it can be animal or plant in nature. It can be manure, it can be a carcass of some poor animal that's died, it can be decaying plant material, it can be the apple core you've just thrown out the window. You know, anything that was once living and has now died undergoes, thankfully due to microorganisms, a process of decay. And actually the soil, and particularly the soil around plant roots, is one of the only places known to be in the whole universe where actually death gets transformed back into life. So it's quite an extraordinary feat. So you have bacteria and fungi, viruses, algae, a whole range of something called archaea, which are like bacteria, and other things called protists. But you have a whole load of very minute microorganisms that start that process of breakdown at the first level within the soil food web. They themselves build up their own bodies. They're full of nutrients, full of nitrogen, for instance. They die. Other things break them down. They get eaten by these little worm-like creatures called nematodes, which are one of the most abundant life forms on Earth, apparently. other little miniature arthropods will eat them. Bigger things that we're maybe more used to seeing, like millipedes and centipedes, will eat those. Eventually you start getting animal life coming in, so mammals and birds. You've got a whole network of soil life, eating, dying, decaying, growing, excreting. And that keeps nutrient in the soil, in small packages, if you like. And through those processes, those complex interactions, nutrients get released in forms that can be used by plants for growth. Now, it's easy to think that maybe the soil biology is all about nutrients and recycling of nutrients. You know, the soil food web is Earth's great recycling. What has been increasingly clear in the last few decades is the importance of the microbiology around a plant's roots within the soil. So it's not simply about recycling nutrients, though that is a key element. And one thing that was quite intriguing when it was first discovered is that when a plant, you know, plants are, apart from some marine algae, plants are the only thing on the planet that can make their own food. You know, the rest of us would be stuffed if plants couldn't do that. And they do that because they have chloroplasts, which can trap light energy and convert it into sugars. Now, that's quite a nifty, clever thing to be able to do, and it's also quite an energy intensive thing for the plant to do. Yet, whilst it's photosynthesizing in that way and creating those sugars, it actually gives away, it pumps out of its root system in the form of exudates some of that carbohydrate, some of those sugars. Now, it needs the energy for its own growth and metabolism, so why on earth is it pumping it out into the soil? Well, it turns out that it does that in order to feed a whole array of soil life, microscopic life, around its root zone. Why? Well, because that microscopic life has a symbiotic relationship with the plant, where it's a win-win situation. So in exchange for feeding those microbes, they themselves are able to get nutrients out of the soil that the plant is unable to, particularly things like phosphorus, which is actually quite difficult to get out of rocks into a form that the plant can use, but microbiology can do it. And so that's one exchange. So it's a trade-off between the two, and both benefit. It's not just about scavenging nutrients, though. There's other symbiotic relations between this microbiology and the plant itself. So if a plant gets attacked by a pest, it can send a signal down out through its root system to the microbiology, the bacteria, the fungi, the protists, the archaea that are surrounding its root system, and attract certain microbes that are able to produce a substance which the plant will then take up that will deter the pest. So I mean, a plant is stuck in the soil. It can't run away from a predator, but it can, with the help of the microbiome that's in its roots, around its roots and within its root system, protect itself to some extent. Now, of course, a plant that's grown in impoverished soil is going to have much more difficult job doing that. The necessary microbiology may simply not be there, which is one reason why, if you're growing crops in a degraded soil, you may well need to add more pesticides fungicides or whatever to try to keep your plant healthy. I mean, microbiology, microbes are something else really. I think the thing to remember about them, this is an electron micrograph of a plant's root and those tiny protrusions coming off a root hairs, and the strings and the blobs are fungal strands and bacteria, archaea, protists that surround the rhizosphere. I think one thing that's important to note about microbes is that they predate us. I mean, it's inadequate to say by a long time. You know, microbial life on Earth probably started 3.6 billion years ago. Now, that's again one of these huge figures that's hard to wrap your head around, but an analogy that's often used is if you thought of life on Earth and the evolution of life on Earth as a year in length. Human beings, us as animals, we only appeared at 1 minute to midnight on the 31st. The microbiology appeared an awful lot earlier. And so it's hardly surprising that our evolution has depended upon these pre-existing forms of life. In fact, any multicellular life has co-evolved through the efforts of microbes and microbiota. So to grow a healthy soil, you need to feed it. It's the organic matter that will feed microbiology that will allow the plant to thrive and be full of nutrients. I'm sure many of you are aware that the nutrients that are present in our food have fallen dramatically since the 40s and 50s, and that's in large part due to our depleting our soils the way we do. Ideally, you have living plants in your soil all the time. You disturb it as little as possible, i.e. try not to plough it, and avoid monocultures. Have a diversity. Diversity equals resilience. And that's a plug for Schumacher College of what's known as alley cropping, where trees with their perennial root systems, in this case their apple trees, have grown, they're quite young, they've grown up quite a bit since that photo was taken, but the crops are grown in wide alleys between these trees. And there are all sorts of clever ways in which you can avoid monocultures and increase the biodiversity within your food production system. That's just to say the importance of organic matter. Basically, if you're not eating it, it should go back to the land. The law of return is key to keeping our soils healthy. We can't continue to just take. We need to put the carbon back, we need to put the organic matter back. And there are various ways of doing this. Other ways by the use of green manures. And of course, if you've got animals in the system, if it's a mixed farming system, then you've got animal manure. And Rupert Sheldrake talked about human waste in one of the Earth talks fairly recently. And that's, again, how we waste our waste. It's not very clever, basically. Okay, so I've talked about the importance of soil microbiology to create healthy soils and healthy plants, nutrient-rich plants, which of course then go on to feed us, hopefully. But I want to now come on to the other strand of the talk, which is our microbiology. And we are covered in microbes. I mean, the Earth is absolutely covered in microbes, and we just wouldn't be here without them, like I say. And of course, the genetic reservoir held within microbiome, the global microbiome, far exceeds ours, of course. We're actually quite impoverished when it comes to our own genome, in terms of, there was a lot of excitement when the Human Genome Project was launched, and wondering what was going to be discovered, and medicine was going to target things based on our genome. But we've got a rather paltry number of genes. We're somewhere between a fruit fly and a flea, I think. Yet we're these highly complex organisms, and basically it makes more sense to think of our human bodies as superorganisms, really, because we wouldn't be able to function if it wasn't for part of that ecosystem that we can't see, which is the microbiome. If you look into this, you'll read different figures, but something like we're outnumbered in terms of the number of cells that we walk around with. We probably have 3 times as more microbial cells on us than we do our own cells, and some people put the figure higher at 10. Now, every part of our body has this microbiome, but a lot of it is concentrated within our digestive tract. So, I mean, if you actually think of the digestive tract, and maybe you don't think about it too much, but it's basically a hollow tube from our mouth to our anus, and really it's the environment. Our bodies are closed around the external environment, and that's a setup that you see in a lot of animals. Possibly all, but no, that's not true. Now, a lot of our microbiome is concentrated in our digestive tract, and a huge amount of that is in the latter part of our digestive tract, which is our colon. We have our stomach, which is very acidic. Not much will survive in our stomach. So those of you that suffer with Helicobacter pylori will know that some things can cause issue heartburn. So some microbes can, but many don't. But as you enter into the small intestine, where simple sugars are broken down and then move on into the large intestine and into the colon, the microbiology goes through the roof in terms of the number of microorganisms that we have within our gut. Interestingly and intriguingly, when it comes to our immune system, which is a key part of our health, I'm sure you've all know when you catch a cold, people talk about their glands being swollen. They're our lymph nodes, and our lymphatic system is a key part of our immune system. 80% of our lymphatic system is wrapped around our gut, something called the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. So that's a clue to the importance of our gut in terms of our ability to keep our bodies healthy. So we have this gut-associated lymphoid tissue, and I want to talk about how that interacts with the microbiome that's held within the lumen, the inside of our, particularly our colon. Now, just as a plant root will pump out exudates to feed its microbiome, it turns out that the cells that line our colon secrete a mucus. Now, when I was at medical school, that was thought essentially to help the transit of foodstuffs through by peristalsis, by the contraction of your gut that will move stuff through. So when you swallow it, it will eventually come out the other end. However, it's now known that that mucus also contains food for the microbiome. So very much like a plant that pumps its sugars out through its root system, we feed our own colonic microbiome. And again, it's done for the purposes of a win-win deal, a symbiotic relationship. What are these bacteria doing for us? Well, just like I said earlier, they have a vast genetic reservoir which allows them to do all sorts of things that we simply couldn't do. A big part of that is to digest some of the foodstuffs, particularly the higher fibre stuff. So if we're going to get anything from what we put into our mouths in terms of energy, we're completely reliant upon our microbiology for it to do that for us. Interestingly, when it comes to poor health, our lymphoid tissue, our immune system, certain cells within that, these rather strange-looking dendritic cells, dendron meaning tree-like, so they can put out these branches, they can send up a branch up through the tight, or hopefully tight junctions in your gut lining, into the lumen of the gut, and they basically have a look round for what microbiology is there, particularly to see is it friend or foe. But it's a means of communicating. It's how our immune system, our lymph tissue, communicates with our gut microbiology. And it sort of can break off a bit of microbe and take it back down and present it, as it were, to other parts of our immune system, to part of our immune defense system known as T cells. Now, if it's depending on that, so the different T cells can recognize certain bits of material that come from the microbiome. So if that bit of, say, a bacteria, if that bit that's taken off by the dendritic cell and presented to the T cell, if the T cell has a receptor for that, it's known as an antigen. You will have heard during coronavirus about antigen testing, but it's a way that cells can recognize each other, particularly our immune system cells. If it's recognized, the T cell can produce an antibody, and it may well end up labeling that bit of bacteria and mounting immune defense, which may result in it being killed. Now, that's a key thing that to protect us, and it would spark off an inflammatory response. So depending on what microbiology is there, the dendritic cell will communicate with the T cell, and the T cell, if it recognizes it, will then go on to do something, often to cause an inflammatory response, including the production of T cells that can actually kill if it's invading pathogen. There are other types of T cells that, if they, depending on what the microbiology is, what the antigen gets presented, that actually work to prevent inflammation. And that really is key, because when we talk about what kills us these days, and I'm very aware of the irony of saying this during the coronavirus pandemic, but infectious diseases don't kill us the way they used to. We're dying worldwide, we're dying of chronic disease far more than infectious disease. And I'll come on to why that's the case in a minute, but a lot of those chronic diseases are being increasingly linked to chronic inflammation. So, in fact, even coronavirus, some of the worst people that end up on ITU, it's thought that it's an overreaction of our immune system to the virus, something called the cytokine storm. So whilst we need the inflammation, you know, if I don't know, pierce myself on a bamboo cane and get a bit of bamboo stuck in my finger and it swells up and starts traveling up my arm, yes, please, I want my body to defend against that, and I possibly will need an antibiotic to see it off. So we need this defense system. We need our inflammation. It's a good thing in an acute situation. However, if it carries on and it's not modulated in any way, then we're in for chronic diseases. And it turns out, like I say, that a key part of all of this is that the microbial community in our gut is able to switch on parts of our immune system that can quieten down that inflammation and keep that inflammation in balance. And it's now thought increasingly that, let me go back to that slide. It's now thought increasingly, there's certainly, what's for sure is there is definite correlations between impoverished gut microbiome in humans and chronic disease. What more work needs to be carried out on is whether they're causative. So there's links, there's correlations with things like Parkinson's disease, with autism, with depression, with Crohn's disease, with leaky gut syndrome, a whole host of chronic diseases that are on the rise. I mean, it's shocking in the United States. And hopefully we won't follow suit, but we seem to be good at following some of the things America does. Up to 40% of children are diagnosed with a chronic illness. That's children. The slide I showed earlier showed the rise of type 2 diabetes. When I was working as a doctor, type 2 diabetes, we were taught that that was old onset diabetes. Children are now getting that in the UK. So these chronic inflammatory diseases are on the rise. This slide basically is it's a possibly somewhat clumsy attempt to show that it's not really, when you think about it, it's not really surprising that we are so dependent on our microbes, completely dependent on the microbes. Like I say, they existed far in advance of and have been the driving force, really, of all the complex multicellular life that we enjoy on the planet. I won't go into the detail of these slides, but if you look at the tree of life, animals, fungi, and plants are in that corner, that blue corner. Most of it is microbiology. And what the other slide is showing, that if it wasn't for mergers amongst that microbiology, complex life, including plants, animals, and fungi, simply would not have evolved. So it's not surprising that we need our microbes. I put this in to show the fact that we're no longer dying of things like infectious diseases anywhere near. I mean, people are, of course, still dying of coronavirus, TB, cholera. You know, it's not that infectious diseases don't cause death anymore, but for a lot of the world, improvements in sanitation and the use of antibiotics, of course, have meant that we no longer die of those things anywhere near. But we are now on a pathway for dying of chronic disease, coronary artery disease, lung disease. One factor that may be, those chronic diseases, like I say, are increasingly being correlated with a lack of diversity within our gut microbiology. I just wanted to say, just to throw in for, we don't have time to go into it now, but there is evidence that the supposedly safe glyphosate, of course, is now being labelled a carcinogen. That the people that produce glyphosate always say it's safe for humans because it attacks a metabolic pathway that humans don't have. But of course, plants have that metabolic pathway, but so do microbes, and many of those microbes are microbes that are vital to us. I'll just throw that in there for good work. I need to round up, of course, because time is going on, but I find both these things really fascinating. Soil microbiology, of which I have learnt quite a bit about through the course of food growing, and what to me is this new field that I'm starting to explore. Other people are doing the research, of course, but about our gut microbiology. And I find it hard to believe that the two aren't connected. So it was very satisfying to see that there are now studies showing that soil microbiology and gut microbiology do interact. The soil is one of the most extensive natural reservoirs of microbial genes, and like I say, we need that genetic information. Microbes trade genetic information like mad. They don't need to undergo sexual reproduction to do that. We are very dependent on those genes to manufacture things that we need for metabolism to happen. We just wouldn't function. The driving force of any complex system on Earth is its microbiology. And the soil and soil microbiology, that's one factor in impoverishing our gut. Another is, of course, there's a nice graphic showing it here. In pre-industrial times, there would be a whole interaction between our environment, of which soil would have been an important part, and also our own waste, plus the plant microbiology. These broken lines here are showing how those links are all being weakened. And this lack of diversity within our soil gut microbiology leads to this new term that talk about dysbiosis in the gut, and it's thought to be a big driving factor, like I say, many of these chronic diseases. And this, a lot of what I said, but this slide, this image comes from David Montgomery and Anne Binkley's book about the hidden half of nature. But it's useful to think of the gut and the rhizosphere and plant life as mirror images of each other. The plant feeds its microbiome, our gut we feed our own microbiome. And in return, we get metabolites, we get better defense systems and better nutrients, things that basically keep our systems running. So the idea that we're superorganisms, and these superorganisms, the soil, the superorganism that is the rhizosphere, and the superorganism that is us and our microbiota, I should say, interact, is the ripe area for further investigation and research. And I love these two images because, to me, that's one way of convincing ourselves of the importance of the links between the two. The one on the one with the blue predominant is gut microbiology breaking down plant fibre. We wouldn't be able to digest plant fibre otherwise. And the other is microbiology in a compost heap breaking down the cellulose in a plant. And I just think it's striking the similarities between those two and how those two mechanisms are so closely related. In a nutshell, if we farm well and grow our food well, we will be healthy. And I know that's a very simplistic statement, but I'm going to, we'll solve our health, well, not solve, maybe that's too strong a statement, but we will certainly reverse a lot of our chronic illness health crisis that our hyper-developed nations are suffering from. And we've got huge potential if we change our farming practices to reverse some of the ecosystem and climate chaos that we've created. So I'm going to leave it there, and hopefully Tim will reappear to field any questions that people may have, and I'll do my best to answer that.
Thank you so much, Jane. That was really, really interesting. And apologies to everybody about the sound quality at various points. Sorry, Jane, you were breaking up at various points, but
Right.
I certainly heard everything you said, I think, though sometimes you sounded slightly more machine than animal. But, thank you so much. That was absolutely great. Maybe we could jump it straight into some of the questions. And if you've got questions that you'd like to ask Jane, then please put them up either in the chat or the Q&A. The Q&A in some ways is better, though you might not be able to see everybody else's questions. And I had been formulating a question I wanted to ask, and then Jill's asked it in an even better way. So I'm going to ask Jill's question instead, which was amazing research is being done in the homeopathic world on bowel nosodes or something, remedies made from bowel flora and fauna. And these remedies have a huge sphere of influence, not least in mental health and emotional states. Is any work being done on this in mainstream science, and is in their reference material and research already available for homeopathic studies?
Well, I have to fess up here. I know very little about homeopathy, which doesn't mean I don't think it's important. In terms of using gut microbiology as a medical treatment, yes, that is an increasing area of research, and I didn't have time to talk about it, but there's one syndrome that's being increasingly problematic in the States, and I'm sure over here it will be on the rise as well, is this Clostridium difficile. So people that have had too many antibiotics and wiped out their gut flora, and that could be medically prescribed antibiotics, but it could also, if you're eating food that's been pumped full of antibiotics as well, that can decimate your gut flora. And as in any ecosystem, if one species becomes dominant, it can wreak havoc. So if Clostridium difficile, which is normally kept in check by our own gut microbiology, takes hold, people get very, very ill. And a trial was done, this is, some of you will have heard of fecal transplants, where somebody with a good gut microbiology, some of their feces are literally transplanted into the colon of the person that's suffering with the syndrome. And they started a trial that they had to, for ethical reasons, end, because the fecal transplants were being so successful that they didn't feel it was ethical to keep the controls not receiving them. So yeah, it's a vast area of increasing research, and I'm sure it will change our attitudes to, well, I hope it will change our attitudes to what we eat and how we grow our food.
And picking up that kind of point, an anonymous attendee has asked, which I think is along very similar lines almost, in terms of trying to make sure we don't end up with some of those diseases later because we've wrecked our microbiome. But we know how to feed our soil, but how best to feed our gut?
Yes, well, that's a very good question. Essentially, you need a diet that's high in plant fiber, because that's the stuff that feeds your, will give you a healthy gut microbiology. And the Western diet, unfortunately, has had less fiber in it than it used to have. We had a phase of having a very high protein, low carbohydrate diet, when since the 80s and onwards we're shifting, people are probably eating less meat and shifting to more carbohydrate again, but it's not always carbohydrate that's full of fiber, and it's the plant fiber that our microbiology eats, and the metabolites, the products from their eating that fiber for us, can actually spark off parts of our immune system that quells the inflammation. So basically eat lots and lots of veg, and of course make sure it's organically grown.
That sounds like great advice. The Silicol says, what do you think about growing plants hydroponically? And certainly if I look at kind of the Dutch system and so on, now there seems to be an increasing move towards a lot of market garden stuff being grown, almost vertically, hydroponically. And they seem like incredibly sterile environments in terms of the mycelium you were talking about so earlier on.
Yes. Well, I once had, I don't know if you call it the privilege, to visit Thanet Earth, which is in Kent, and it grows tomatoes in these huge hydroponic glass houses. and they don't let people in easily. I was lucky to be able to join a group that went in, and we had to tog up in bio, you know, it was like PPE gone mad, to get into these greenhouses, and they were all, you know, these very healthy looking plants growing out of with bees imported for pollination. And my gut sense was, I don't want to eat these things. I don't want this to be the way forward. And I know some people argue, particularly, you know, you can recycle the water, etc., etc. But I don't have scientific studies to back it up. But my sense of it is, I just don't think it can be good for us. We need that microbiology. And unless you're going to start adding it to those hydroponic systems, I don't see how you're going to get it. And I just think nature does it better. So just look after the soil and grow your plants in the soil is my personal view on that.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose, are you aware of any studies that try to look at some of the foodstuffs that has been grown hydroponically? Is there a kind of sense that it lacks even fewer nutrients, or has even fewer nutrients than you talked earlier on about how the quality of the foodstuffs we consume now is so much poorer than the foodstuffs in the 1950s and 60s. But is there a sense that that hydroponic food looks lovely but actually is lacking?
I don't know enough about it, is the very short answer to that. What I would say is that when we're looking at the nutrients within food, there's macronutrients and micronutrients, and in hydroponic systems, I don't know how much of the micronutrients are added to the mix. Certainly in non-hydroponic farming systems, the fertilizers tend to be the big three of nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, yet it's those micronutrients that are so key to ensuring our health, and of course our gut health as well. But the short answer is no, I don't know.
No, thank you, Jane.
Very good question.
Yeah, no, it would just be interesting to know, wouldn't it? Is it because I think probably most of us feel exactly the same way about the idea of the hydroponics, but we need some evidence. So I'm also really interested in some of the things you talked about at the beginning around, you know, kind of whether it's no-dig systems or agroforestry or a combination of all of these in order to try and create a more diverse microbial environment underneath the soil. But I suppose one of the questions that would come back, certainly from those big multinational farms ploughing out the divisions between fields and trying to create massive multi-acre fields, would be how on earth do you scale that up? How do you make it an economically viable model? And even when you spoke about it in relation to a number of places in the world where people are farming by family, as it were, with very few additional bits of equipment, almost, you know, barely being able to feed themselves as a consequence of this. So,
yes, well, they, of course, the barely being able to feed themselves is an economic issue rather than they can't produce food for themselves. They're well able to do that. Yeah, I mean, there's no one solution to, there's no one right way to farm, but there is farming. There's a variety of ways, but the main thing is that on balance, you're replenishing the soil, not degrading it. You're putting carbon back into the soil. Now, there are people, particularly in the States, they use a lot of no-till farming, but they rely on glyphosate to cope with the weeds. Now, I personally don't think that's the way forward, but some people will argue that that's the lesser of two evils, really. In that you at least aren't disturbing the soil. But there are people that are managing to do no-till farming without the use of herbicides, and there are clever systems being developed. If anybody from the college that went to the Oxford Rural Farming Conference is listening, they might be able to quickly type in, I can't remember the name of the farm, but at the Oxford Rural Farming Conference last year, and you can get to that material online, there was a very good presentation by a farm in Germany that's had very good results with using no-till and mulch systems. It's a very big question, but it can be done basically. how it will be done, the exact way it will be done, will vary from location to location, depending on your climate, depending on your soil, depending on your particular situation. But we don't need large-scale monocrops to feed the world. It's inefficient and it doesn't actually feed very many people at all.
Yeah. Jane, I think sadly we're probably going to have to draw it to a conclusion just because I think we're about 6 or 7 minutes over. It was an absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you so much. And lots of people saying in the sidebar, I hope we can have a good recording without the sound problems and so on. And so let's see what our recording's like, and it may be better than the live stream. But it was really, really enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Tim. And can I just put a big thank you to Jane Hall and the short course team for all the work they put into creating the Earth Talks. It's much
absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jane, as well. So could I just thank everybody for joining us again tonight and supporting the work of Schumacher College. Our next Earth Talk is with Satish Kumar, Soil Soul Society, on the 25th of September, live in the Great Hall and also online. And the following night we have a talk with Barn the Spoon as part of his spoon carving short course, also taking place the same weekend at Dartington. So I hope that Jane Gleeson's talk has whetted your appetite, in which case I'd point you towards the Forest Gardens and Edible Ecosystems short course, which is taking place at the end of April 2021. And Jane was telling me yesterday is actually rather better timing for it, almost in terms of the things which are able to be explored. So we're also in the process of validating a BSc in Sustainable Food Farming and Enterprise, and an MSc in Regenerative Food Farming and Enterprise, both of which are due to start in September 2021. In addition, we'll have our residency in Sustainable Horticulture again running this year, and there'll be opportunities to apply for that for people. All these opportunities complement the other short courses and MA programs available at Dartington and Schumacher College, so do please look at the website, subscribe to our mailing list and follow us on Twitter for information on courses, as well as dates, times, speakers for future Earth Talks and events. So as ever, we'd love to have your feedback on how we can continue to improve, and also we'd love to hear about the issues, topics or speakers you'd like to see in the future. So can I thank you all again for your very active participation, and thanks again so much, Jane Gleeson.
Thank you. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you all, and good night.
Good night.